It's Christmas night, 1776. The wind is cutting, the river is frozen with jagged chunks of ice, and the soldiers of George Washington's army are wrapped in thin coats that barely hold back the cold. Their boots are worn through. Some march barefoot, leaving blood on the frozen ground. This army is starving, beaten, and teetering on the edge of collapse. Across the river, in the small town of Trenton, the men they are about to face sleep soundly after a day of feasting, drinking, and celebration. They are not British Redcoats. They are not colonists loyal to the king. They are foreign soldiers, hired from across the ocean. They speak German. Their uniforms are different. Their weapons are polished and ready, their drills precise, their discipline unshaken. They are the Hessians, soldiers from small German states rented out to fight in a war that has nothing to do with them. The colonists fear them, revile them, and paint them as merciless killers. But here is the strange twist. The story of the Hessians does not end with them as faceless villains. Thousands of them would remain in America long after the war ended. They would marry, farm, raise children, and leave behind a legacy that is still woven into the fabric of the United States today. The question is, how did mercenaries, despised as foreign invaders, become an invisible thread in the story of America? How do enemies transform into ancestors? That's the journey we're taking today. To answer that question, we need to step back to Europe in the mid-1700s. Germany, as we know it today, didn't exist. Instead, the land was divided into hundreds of small states, duchies, counties, electorates, and principalities, each ruled by its own prince or elector. Some were rich trading centers, but many were poor, agricultural, and constantly strapped for cash. Among them was Hesse-Kassel, a small state ruled by Landgrave Frederick II. He realized something clever, something that today might sound strange, even appalling. His soldiers could be a source of income. In his state, military service was part of life. A large percentage of the population was conscripted, trained, and drilled from an early age. And when foreign powers like Britain needed extra manpower, Frederick could rent them out. This wasn't entirely unusual in Europe at the time. Armies were expensive to maintain, and rulers often loaned troops to each other. But Hesse-Kassel and a handful of other German states made it into an industry. Britain, fighting a war in far-off America, found this especially useful. Recruiting enough British men to cross the Atlantic was unpopular and costly. Why not supplement with trained, disciplined soldiers from Germany? And so contracts were signed. Money flowed into the German states, and in return, men were loaded onto ships bound for America. They didn't volunteer. Many were conscripts, torn from farms, workshops, and families. Some were debtors, offered a grim choice between prison or the army. Others were orphans or the poor, scooped up and trained to march and fight. Only a small minority were professional soldiers who joined willingly. For most, there was no real choice. By the end of the war, nearly 30,000 German auxiliaries would serve in America. Hesse-Kassel sent the most, so they all became known as Hessians to the colonists, even though many came from Brunswick, Waldeck, or other states. They were not mercenaries in the strictest sense, because mercenaries are soldiers who sell their services directly. These men never saw a penny of the money Britain paid. Their rulers pocketed the cash. They were, more accurately, rented men, commodities in a political bargain. Imagine what that meant. You didn't choose this war. You didn't even know the people you were about to fight. But you had to board the ship anyway. When the Hessians first arrived in America, they made an immediate impression. Colonists had already been warned about them. Pamphlets described them as brutal, cruel, and inhuman. It was said they slaughtered prisoners, plundered towns, and terrified women and children. Some of this was exaggeration, propaganda meant to inflame colonial anger, but some was grounded in truth. The Hessians were professional soldiers, trained to fight with cold discipline. At the Battle of Long Island in 1776, they fought alongside the British and helped deliver one of the most crushing defeats of the Revolution. Colonial militias, made up of farmers and townsfolk, broke and ran when faced with the bayonet charges of drilled Hessian troops. The reputation of the Hessians grew. These were men who would not falter, who would not hesitate, who fought like machines. And yet, the battle that cemented their place in history was not one they won, but one they lost. On Christmas night, 1776, George Washington launched his desperate gamble. His ragged force crossed the icy Delaware River and marched through snow and sleet to attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The Hessians, commanded by Colonel Johann Roll, were taken completely by surprise. Some say they were still recovering from Christmas celebrations. Others point out that their scouts had warned of American movements, but Roll dismissed the threat. When Washington's troops stormed into town, chaos erupted. Roll tried to rally his men, but was mortally wounded. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. For the Americans, it was a miracle. The Revolution had been saved from collapse. For the Hessians, it was a bitter humiliation. After Trenton, Hessians continued to fight throughout the war. They served at Brandywine, Germantown, Saratoga, and Yorktown. They were often placed on the front lines, used as shock troops. They endured long marches and harsh winters. They built fortifications, guarded supply lines, and fought with a professionalism the British relied upon. But every time Hessians appeared, the Americans were reminded the king had hired foreigners to crush his own subjects. That image mattered almost as much as the muskets themselves. Behind the battlefield stories is the human reality of what it meant to be a Hessian. Imagine being a young man from a small German village. You wake up one day to find you've been conscripted. Maybe your family begged the local official to spare you, but it didn't matter. You were taken, drilled, and trained. And then suddenly, you were told you were going to America. The voyage was a nightmare. Packed into crowded ships, the air thick with sickness, food infested with maggots, water fouled, men groaning with fever. Many never made it across the ocean. Those who did stepped into a land utterly alien. Vast forests stretched endlessly. Farmers owned huge tracts of land. Even common laborers seemed to live better than peasants back home. Some Hessians were astonished. Letters and diaries show their wonder. They wrote about how much food there was, how fertile the soil seemed, and how free the people acted. Back home, peasants were bound by old laws, taxed heavily, and kept in their place. In America, ordinary men spoke boldly, argued politics, and owned land. For Hessians, this was both bewildering and tempting. Life in the army was hard. They marched long distances, camped in bitter winters, endured hunger, and faced constant danger. Their pay was meager, and much of it was withheld. Morale was uneven. Some stayed loyal to their regiments, but many grew tired and disillusioned. American propaganda targeted them directly. Pamphlets written in German promised land, money, and freedom if they deserted. And thousands did. They slipped away under cover of night, found refuge in villages, and started new lives. Many married local women, settled in Pennsylvania or Virginia, and never looked back. For them, America offered what their homeland never could: independence. Ironically, the very soldiers sent to destroy the revolution were now joining the society it created. To the revolutionaries, the Hessians were the perfect villains. They were not British, they were outsiders. That made them even easier to demonize. Pamphlets and newspapers described them as butchers who killed without mercy. Stories, some real and some exaggerated, spread quickly. Women whispered that Hessians would storm into homes and take whatever they wanted. Children were told to be wary of them. The very word Hessian became a synonym for terror. But propaganda is a powerful tool, and while the Hessians were indeed feared, the reality was more complex. Captured Hessians were often treated fairly. Washington himself insisted that prisoners be housed decently. Many were sent to small towns where they lived and worked among ordinary Americans. They fixed wagons, farmed fields, and even taught music. Communities that once dreaded them grew accustomed to them. Over time, something remarkable happened. Instead of remaining faceless enemies, Hessians became individuals, neighbors, craftsmen, even family. Surnames like Ziegler, Bender, and Eberhardt began to appear in American towns. The Hessians, once symbols of tyranny, were slowly woven into the fabric of local life. This shift in perception reveals something important about the revolution. It wasn't just a war of muskets and battles, it was also a war of ideas, of propaganda, and of hearts and minds. The Hessians became pawns in that struggle, demonized at first, but eventually humanized. So, what was the ultimate legacy of the Hessians? After the war, roughly half returned to Germany, but thousands stayed. They built farms, joined communities, and raised families. They blended into the German-American populations already thriving in Pennsylvania and New York. Their descendants fought in later American wars, stood as citizens, and helped shape the nation. But beyond bloodlines, their legacy is symbolic. They show us how history is full of paradoxes. The Hessians came as enemies, yet became part of the country they were sent to crush. They remind us that wars are fought by ordinary people, swept up by forces larger than themselves. They didn't care about King George's policies or Thomas Jefferson's words. They cared about survival, about food, about family, and yet their choices, their desertions, and their resettlement shaped the new nation. Their presence also laid the groundwork for the great waves of German immigration in the 19th century. They helped establish German-American identity, which left a profound impact on American culture, food, traditions, music, and communities that still exist today. Perhaps the greatest irony is this. The revolutionaries claimed the Hessians were proof of tyranny, proof that the king would unleash foreign oppressors, and in a sense, they were right. But the revolution's triumph transformed those oppressors into Americans. The line between enemy and neighbor blurred, until eventually it vanished. The story of the Hessians isn't just about mercenaries. It's about people. It's about young men forced into a war they didn't choose, in a land they barely understood. It's about propaganda, perception, and the way stories can turn men into monsters or into neighbors. And it's about legacy, the way enemies can become family, and the way history twists in unexpected directions. The Hessians remind us that the American Revolution was not a simple tale of Patriots versus Redcoats. It was a global conflict, involving people from many nations, each with their own struggles and their own reasons for being there. And it reminds us that history is never as simple as the myths we tell. So what do you think? Were the Hessians villains, victims, or something else entirely? And how do you think their legacy still shapes America today. Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.